welcome everyone. Thank you all very much for being here today, and I want to say thank you to our Zoom viewers joining us virtually. This event is Building an Inclusive Democracy: Why Equitable Voter Turnout Matters in the 2020 elections and beyond. Today we're going to present, as I think all of you know, new research from the Center for Inclusive Democracy looking at the state of the electorate, the state of disparities, and the state of participation. We will also hold a series of conversations, panels, with leaders in the democracy space from across the country. So community advocates, former elected or election officials, voting rights experts. Again, from a variety of places and spaces across our nation. And we invite all of you, if you haven't done already, to check out our website, because we have the list of speakers for today, but also their bios as well. Okay, so you're going to hear briefly from Senator Alex Padilla from California. Our closing keynote is Tom Hicks from the EAC, the commissioner from the EAC. And I'm going to start off the day talking about why we want to hold this Democracy Summit. Why is it important? We could have just released our new research and let that be it, right? Focus solely on that work and that release. We didn't want to do that. We wanted to really encourage a greater conversation around equity and representation in the 2020 elections, and of course beyond this upcoming election cycle as well, really the election cycle that we already find ourselves in. We wanted to encourage a conversation beyond the specific findings of our report. So our work, who we are as academic researchers, as educators, as partners in the field, is rooted in the assumption that an inclusive, fully representative democracy is what we should have, right? That it's where we should be, that it's an absolutely critical thing to the overall strength of our nation, its stability, and to seeing our nation's promise really fully realized. Of course, we know that not everybody thinks that an inclusive democracy is a good thing, right? That our representatives, that our democracy, that our republic, right, should be functioning in a way that our elected officials are actually selected by a fully representative, if not a fully participating 100% electorate, at least a fully representative electorate, one that reflects the demographic makeup of our country, right? So, I just want to acknowledge that. I think it's an important thing to acknowledge when we have these conversations. And then we step forward. So today's research report will discuss the state of both representation and also the opportunities for increased mobilization, opportunities around engagement, opportunities around voice, and what we hope and we think, right, really matters in terms of the robustness of our democracy. Getting to that representative electorate in a way where everyone is making those decisions that impact, right, their lives, all of our lives, in a significant way. Yeah. And the work is going to be a frame really for the conversations that we're going to have today, for the panelists, right, that we're going to be going through and presenting to you as the day goes on. Our speakers will discuss why we see the inequalities that we see in the electorate, what can be done to move the needle now, by advocates, by mobilization efforts, by election officials, and what can be done in the long game approach. Before we move on, though, I know that just maybe some of you may not be aware of who we are or what we do, or maybe you're just starting to get to know us. So we actually have a brief video just to describe and talk a little bit more about the work that our center does. Democracy is at the core of who we are as a nation. But to attain the promise of a truly representative and robust democracy, it requires the participation of all Americans in the electoral process by race, ethnicity, age, language needs, disability, or economic status. It requires an electorate that is informed and mobilized, and one that is guaranteed an equitable access to vote and fully participate in government elections. Hello, I'm Mindy Romero, founder and director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy at the USC Sol Price School of Public Policy. For more than a decade, our center has been a leader in election and voting research, data and analysis, with an emphasis on the impacts for voters of color, youth, and other historically underrepresented voters. Policymakers, election officials, and community advocacy groups from across the country have come to rely on our data and studies as critical resources, whether for election decision-making, voter outreach, or public policy development. The Center for Inclusive Democracy is also widely recognized for its online election resources. This includes our voting location and outreach tool, an online interactive mapping platform that communities can use to identify equitably located polling places and drop-box sites, and for doing targeted voter outreach and education. This tool is now available in 14 states, soon to be 18. Thousands of election officials from across the country, community-based organizations, and even the media use it. Throughout the year, our center also organizes briefings, in-person events, webinars on urgent democracy-related topics. We regularly bring together experts in the field to discuss new research, voting trends, election data, and their impact. Our goal is to help find solutions to close gaps in voter access, turnout, and engagement, and identify what can be done to eliminate disparities in our democratic process. We are very committed to the work we do here at the Center for Inclusive Democracy, and looking ahead, we'll be doing even more to expand our nonpartisan national research partnerships and collaborations, debut new data mapping tools, and offer more professional training opportunities in the field. It's never been more urgent to do all that we can to counter the misinformation and threats against our democracy, and to ensure that our election systems are trusted, protected, and accessible to all, so that we might all eventually see a truly representative and inclusive democracy. So you learned a little bit more about us if you weren't aware of who we are and what we do. As a research center, we want to encourage conversations, not just do the research, but with the research, encourage conversations more broadly to recognize and prioritize equity in how our democracy functions and its outcomes, and of course, nonpartisan conversations, right, just to be clear. Over the past few years, there have been a lot of conversations, particularly leading up to this 2024 election cycle, where we've seen a lot of good efforts, a lot of good discussions, convenings, people coming together to discuss the deep concerns that many of us share around the stability of our democracy, the strength of our institutions. And many of these efforts, though, I would contend have talk about how to save our democratic institutions, how we get people to believe in our institutions again, right? They discuss how to strengthen our norms, along with topics such as cybersecurity, misinformation, legal challenges. All of that, of course, is vitally important. But few talk directly in a significant way about equity, right? And few recognize that the differing historic current experiences, historic and current experiences that people have within our democracy, that they have within our institutions or with our institutions, with our norms. And of course, for many community advocacy groups and voting rights groups, they have long worked to question our democratic institutions, to push, fight for reform, for greater access for all. They don't really want to keep the institutions the same, right? They want to move them forward. They want positive change, at least in many, many respects. So we hope, as a center in 2024, that there are more cross conversations, more integrated conversations, more partnerships, so that what emerges post-2024 election is a greater focus on positive change that moves our institutions towards the promise of our democracy. And of course, we are an academic institution. The Center for Inclusive Democracy doesn't take positions on specific policies or election reforms that might get us, to that end. But what we do is we hope to inform those conversations, right, through research and through data and through education and through efforts like today as well. So I'm going to go ahead now and move over to some introductory remarks that we have from Senator Alex Padilla of California, and they are recorded. So,
hi, I'm Senator Alex Padilla, and it's an honor to join the USC Center for Inclusive Democracy as you kick off today's summit. And where better to do it than at USC's brand new Washington, D.C. campus. Congratulations. And thank you for all that you're doing to build a more inclusive, more fair democracy. Now, throughout my public service career, I've been guided by that most basic lesson of our high school civics class, that our democracy works best when as many eligible people participate. Only then can you guarantee a government that reflects and represents the people. And only then can you ensure that the people have faith that their government is working for them and not just the privileged. But democracy takes work. It's the job of each generation to meet the challenges of their time and bring us one step closer to the ideals set out at our founding for a more equal, more perfect union. I mean, even today, nearly 60 years since the Voting Rights Act was signed into law, far too many Americans still face challenges to exercising their sacred right to vote. We've seen bad faith actors at home and abroad stoking the flames of political division. We've seen partisan politicians making it harder for communities of color, for young people, and for lower income communities to make their voice heard at the ballot box. And increasingly, we're seeing election workers threatened, harassed, and undermined for doing their job in carrying out the work of our democracy. So we know that even in 2024, the preservation of our democracy is not a guarantee. As California's Secretary of State, I was proud to make California's elections more inclusive with automatic and same-day voter registration, universal vote by mail, and expanded in-person early voting. And it's because of it that by the time I left that office, we saw the highest voter registration and turnout rates in over 40 years. So we have proven solutions to increase voter participation and engage our communities. But at the same time, we're seeing states undo voter protections and make their elections less accessible. So what we need now is federal action to restore the protections of the Voting Rights Act and to safeguard the right to vote, to protect our election workers, and to ensure that the will of the people cannot be overturned. And to achieve that, we need to continue to engage Americans with events just like this, so that everyone knows what's at stake in each and every election. So thank you again for engaging in our democracy, for working to increase participation, and for building that more perfect union for the next generation. Thank you.
And of course, we want to extend our deepest thanks to Senator Padilla for taking the time and out of his very busy schedule, right, to recognize the event and to talk about really what we're all talking about today, the importance of an inclusive democracy. If you're not familiar with Senator Padilla, as Secretary of State in California, he championed a number of election reforms and really set a tone in a lot of ways in the state and across the country in terms of those that were seeking to understand what California was doing, and a lot of advocates and a lot of other election officials and policymakers have really looked to California to see just what we've been doing over the last 10 years and how that could potentially impact the decisions that they're making or possible future decisions that they're making around election reforms that are aimed at increasing equity and access. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and jump on in here to the research report. So let me move over here to open up the screen again. So our work today that we're releasing actually now online, it's a new report called The New Electorate, The Strength of the Latino, Black, and Asian American Vote. It is really the first in a series of reports that we will be releasing over the next few months. This starts us off with an overview at a national level, and to some degree, some of the report also talks at a state level or presents the data at a state level. But I want folks to understand that we will be kind of tackling different topics as we go forward, and also bringing in where we have research and data on other groups as well. Today we're focused on race ethnicity, largely in the discussion, but we'll also be talking about young people, for instance, coming forward. And I want to thank Anna Meyer, who is my lead data associate data lead at CID, for all the work that she did in leading the efforts around this report. So for those of you who would like to access the report, we've got a QR code. I see phones going up. And of course, those of you online, please take a moment here to grab that if you would like to do so. And then, of course, you can also go to our website. And it's posted on our front page as well as on our publications page under voter turnout research. So if you missed the QR code, you can get it there as well. All right. So I'm going to start off our research report discussion, our presentation of findings, by asking all of you a question. And I'll ask those of you online on Zoom just to, think about it yourself and take a moment to just say, do you know the answer to this question, right? And I do have a few nationally recognized research data experts in the room that they don't get to answer this question. So what was the eligible turnout in the 2020 presidential election? And let me define eligible. Here, we mean adult citizens. So the percentage of those who were eligible to vote, whether they were registered or not, that actually turned out in the 2020 general presidential election. Anybody want to take a stab on this one? Yes. 50% of the eligible voter population turned out. Okay? 65%. Okay, there's a pretty big gap there. Anyone else? 40%. Okay, anyone else? I see faces pondering, thinking. All right. And then I'll ask you this question in a moment, so you can start thinking about what about voters of color. But to answer this question, about 2/3, right? About 66% of eligible voters in the United States turned out to vote. Pretty exciting to see numbers like that. Or not. Does that sound high or not high to you? Sounds high? For both of you over here who said 40 and 50, right, that's a lot higher. It's higher than what you said as well, right, at 65? Yeah.
High for America, not other places.
High for America, right? Exactly. So in the United States, we'll go down that path for just a moment. If you didn't know, we have consistently in basically comparable elections, we have some of the lowest turnout of established democracies around the world, right? So this was a record, or the highest that we know on record in terms of turnout. So for those of us that track these numbers, do the researchers just track and understand it because you're in the advocacy or public communication space in the elections world? You know that was an exciting number, right? Okay. Do you know what turnout was for voters of color? And let's break it out here, specifically Latinos, Blacks, and Asian Americans. And one of the things I'll talk about in a little bit when I get into the data a little bit more specifically is just the limitations that we have in terms of the voter file around identifying race ethnicity. So for what we can identify, for those people that we can identify in terms of the race ethnicity, we have data for Black, Latino, Asian American, white. Anybody have an idea? Hold that thought because I'm going to come back and show you some of the numbers. But I want it to just kind of percolate a little bit. So let's give some context to the research, right? We're going to today largely, and the report largely focuses on 2020 data. We're going into a presidential year 2024. Obviously 2020 is the most recent comparable election. If you didn't know, turnout trends, what's possible or what we typically see for turnout varies quite significantly between midterm and presidential years, right? So you want to look, if you're looking at 2024, you get some idea of 2020, except for the fact that 2020, of course, was such a historically high number. You have to think about what do you expect, right, going into 2024. But you certainly wouldn't look at the midterm numbers. So again, 2/3 of eligible voters, right, cast a ballot. That was up by about 6 percentage points over 2016. 2016 wasn't a bad year either, comparatively speaking, for turnout, but up there. And the turnout itself, the rate generated the largest increase in voters between two US presidential elections on record, 21 million more people voting than in 2016, right? Pretty big numbers that we're seeing. There was a lot of press on this as well, right? Okay, voters of color were a big part of that story. I want to emphasize that at the outset here today as we start going down this path talking about the work and what the research has to show. So the number of Latino, Asian American, and Black voters also grew notably between those two elections. Voters of color were a substantial share of those actually casting a ballot, right? Voting in 2020. And of course, when we talk about election outcomes, now our research is about participation. But when we talk about outcomes actually affecting who wins, who loses in races, we know that voters of color were a substantial part of the story, no matter what across the country, right? A substantial part of the electorate. But certainly in very key states, some swing states, for instance, right? We heard about mobilization efforts that helped write the story of 2020. However, and this is important, as we talk about all of that success and we want to recognize it and lift it up, right, and hopefully encourage it to continue, we also have to recognize that increases in turnout didn't occur at the same rates for voters of color, right, as it did for the overall electorate. And in most cases didn't mitigate inequities in representation. So you hear record high turnout, how exciting, right? So many more voters, period, so many voters of color, so many more voters of color, period. But it doesn't mean, right, that we all of a sudden, right, eliminated disparities, right, deeply held, deeply entrenched disparities that we have in our electoral system. So significant long-standing disparities persisted in eligible voter turnout rates, again, percentage of adult citizens voting, and white, non-Latino, and communities of color in the US continue to be underrepresented in the nation's electorate compared to their share of the eligible voting population. So I'm going to talk in a lot about representation. I've already used that word several times, a number of times this morning. What do I mean here? So there's different ways that we could be thinking or meaning using that word. Talk about how our elected officials are actually representing us in terms of their decisions or work. Here, I mean it numerically. So for a group to be numerically represented in the electorate, it means that, if you don't know, that their share of the vote, those actually casting a ballot in a given election, is about the same as their share of the eligible voter population. So if a group is 30% of eligible voters, to be numerically represented, they'd be 30% of actual voters in that election, right? 20%, 20%, 5%, 5%. Now, individual advocacy groups and communities might want to see more representation, but we're just talking about numeric representation. If you're less than, if that doesn't line up and your percentage of the vote is less than your share of the eligible voter population, then you're underrepresented. What leads to underrepresentation is disparities in turnout. If everybody voted at the same rates, high or low, right, we would see a representative electorate. We'd want to get closer to 100, right? I assume everybody in this room. But it's the disparities in turnout that produce underrepresentation, produce a pie of the electorate that doesn't look like the rest of, or doesn't look like the eligible voter population. And you'll keep hearing me say eligible voter population. It also doesn't look like the population of the United States. But when we're talking about numeric comparisons and the fair kind of comparison is to look at the share of the eligible voter population, right? Okay, so even with these continued, right, disparities, we didn't suddenly see an elimination of disparities. We know, though, that there is a quite significant level of potential, right, for voters of color in terms of their impact. Already having impact, but much more could be seen. Greater voice, greater parts of a greater influence, on the decisions that are made, right, for people's lives, right, elected officials, ballot measures, whatever it might be. So combined, the three groups that we're focusing on today, Latinos, Blacks, and Asian Americans, comprise 22% of voters casting a ballot in the 2020 general election. Again, historically high, but here we're talking about percent of the pie of voters, and nearly 30% of those eligible to vote in the United States. With growing population numbers, voters of color are positioned to have, as I said, right, a greater impact, greater potential impact. Now, am I saying demography is destiny? No, right? Because the work has to happen. But what we do know is if turnout rate stayed the same, right? Now, we did have a record year, but let's just say that We didn't see any significant shift in turnout rates. We didn't see any significant shift in the gap, the disparity gap in turnout rates, right, by race ethnicity. Then, because of sheer population growth, right, we would see same percent but bigger denominator, right? You're going to see more voters of color, right, participating. But if the disparities stay the same, you're still going to see underrepresentation at the ballot box. Again, as I defined it, numeric representation, right? Because if the disparity gap stays the same, you're going to see pretty similar underrepresentation going forward. So growing numbers, right? More impact in that sense, but still a continued underrepresentation story. If we see higher turnout rates and a narrowing of the turnout disparity gap, then you could see less underrepresentation or more representation. The question is just how much do you narrow those gaps? Of course, again, if you eliminate them completely, then you get a representative electorate, right? All right. So if we think about the 2024 general election and we look forward to that, right? And of course beyond, it's really critical to really identify those opportunities across the country at a state level, at a sub-state level, at a neighborhood level. And I'm not talking in a partisan way, I'm talking in a nonpartisan way, right? To identify those communities that are particularly underrepresented. We want to see the hot spots. You hear that sometimes, right? People will focus on the hot spots of where the greatest higher turnout might be, right, for voters of color. Some of those conversations are specific to election outcomes, right? Some are not. Some are again, very much driven by great advocacy work, nonpartisan advocacy work. What we often don't see the conversations focused on communities that don't have, that maybe are the cool spots. Because so much of our work is around still, right, and funded around, and I say us, the field, funded around the election cycle, and so much of the focus is on states that might have larger populations or maybe a larger impact in something like a presidential race, right? So even nonpartisan efforts will still end up being kind of more funded in those kinds of areas. And we often see those communities that don't have as much, that have even greater underrepresentation, continue to have that underrepresentation because they're not getting that mobilization. But if we turned, right, to understanding and really seeking a mobilization strategy that kind of, aside from how it impacts outcomes of elections, is just about representation, then you could certainly make the case that the communities that are most underrepresented, right, should have even more resources, right? And that also means, by the way, that they potentially are the places where you can see the biggest increase, right? Most underrepresented, most kind of largest share of communities that they're eligible but not turning out. Those are the areas that you could have the biggest kind of difference in the disparity story and in the representation story. So as I mentioned earlier, this is the first in a series of reports, and we are going to do some analysis by swing states. We're going to do some analysis by competitive congressional districts. But in that work, as we put it out, we are emphasizing not that that's where we think the analysis should be. We think it's important, right, to understand that, because so much of the work, the goals that are happening around election mobilization are happening in those geographies. But we also emphasize at the same time where the opportunities are beyond those competitive states or jurisdictions. Make sense? Okay. So methodology for the report, and then I'm going to get into some slides for the report itself. Just really quickly, happy to answer questions in the Q&A, but we're looking at actual voter files supplied to us by Catalyst, which is a national data vendor, very well known in terms of the collection and processing of voter files across the United States. We, of course, used for our population data from the US Census and the American Community Survey, 5-year estimates, decennial data census, and then for a brief conversation in the report, we also utilize the population projections, the brand new ones that were just, fairly new, recently put out by the census, 2023. The report looks at the changing demographic landscape, turnout rates in recent elections, 2020, 2016, 2022, 2018. We do a comparison. Largely, the report's looking at presidential years, but we also do the same analysis and provide it for midterms, because midterms are important to discuss now as well, period, as we understand the electorate and the profile of the electorate. But because we're going into 2024, more of the conversation is focused on that. And then, of course, we look at opportunities for mobilization by state. So demographic change. As the population in the US, no surprise, we're ever diversifying, right? As the population grows, the racial and ethnic makeup of the country continues to diversify. What we've got here, and I know people on Zoom can see these really well, just want to make sure everybody else can. We look here from 2010 to 2020, decennial census data from the US Census, and we're looking at the percent change on the far right. So Asian Americans, of these four groups, including whites, we see the largest percent change, right, over 2010 when we're looking at 2020. 35%, black 6%, Latino 23%, white actually a slight decrease, negative 2.6%, and the total population up about 7% during that time period, 2010 to 2020. People of color are comprising an increasing share of the population, so there's kind of the change in absolute numbers, and then there's the share. There's that makeup, that pie, right, the population pie. What does that look like? So by 2020, if we look at Asian American, that first row, we went from 4.8 in 2010 to 2020, 6.1. Black, 12.2 to 12.1. And this is again, the proportional pie, right? Latino, 16.3 to 18.7, white 63% to about 58%. Now you see a slight decrease there in black, but that's because so much of the change is from Latinos and Asian Americans, so it's changing the proportional story. Okay, welcome. And then looking at those projections that I referenced a moment ago, by 2045, and if you can see in the back, white is the red line, purple is for Latinos, black is blue, Asian American is green, and gold is all other populations combined. So by 2045, the census projects 50% of the total US population will be white, down from 57 in 2025. And if you're curious, by 2050, it actually falls below 50%. So we're looking at 50-24, so by 2045, Latinos will be about a quarter of the US population, 14% for Black, 8.5% for Asian American. Again, that's a combined, and actually includes Pacific Islander as well. And then we've got all other combined at 3.1. Okay, the growth in the Latino, Asian American, and Black populations eligible to vote also. So we're talking about population. We should remember we're talking about voting, and we're talking about representation, numeric representation, as I defined it a little while ago. We should also be looking at the change in the eligible voter population, right? And of course, we've seen significant change, right, since 2010. Asian American, 38, Black, 14.5, Latino, 51, this is over the numbers, not share numbers, 2.9 for white, 11% for the overall population. And now we'll look at the share, Asian American, by 2020, 4.5% of the US eligible voter, right, adult citizen population, Black 12.5, Latino 12.8, and then white 67.6. So white's still quite a large proportion of the eligible voter population, right? So that's important to keep in mind when we talk about diversity and population demographic change. Eligible voter population is still quite significant, but the proportional story is different, right? And significant when we're talking about voting and eligible voter numbers. Okay, between elections, the number of registered voters of color increased at notably higher rates than whites. So if we'll just focus today on 2016 to 2020 presidential elections, and we can see here for the registered voter population between that time, right, 30 for Asian Americans, 47 for voter population, Black, I'll just go across, but for registered voter, 10, Latino 25, white 5.3, general population 9. Okay, we're going to get into eligible voter turnout. And actually, before I do that, so I defined that earlier as the percent of those that are eligible to vote, adult citizens, right, who actually cast a ballot, whether they were registered or not. Just want to say a quick thing about measuring turnout. So the two typical ways that we see turnout measured when we talk about a rate, it's eligible voter turnout or it's registered voter turnout, which is the share of the registered voter population. Your denominator is only registered voters. Sometimes we'll hear the word turnout used, but really people are talking about absolute numbers, they're not talking about a rate. Population, that can be, as we saw in one of the first slides, right, in huge numbers, but the question is, what does that actually look like in terms of the percent, right, of a overall population when we talk about voting at the ballot box. So we always emphasize wherever possible to use eligible voter turnout numbers for lots of reasons, but probably the main reason is that we have still significant disparities in registration rates in the United States. And that's the share of those that are eligible to register and vote that are registered, right? The registration rate in the US. So by race, ethnicity, and many other statuses, we'll talk about age as well, we know that registration rates are not only persistent and also entrenched, and although we've seen improvements, certainly since the Voting Rights Act, there's still very much quite significant differences. You can have a high registration rate, but you can have a high registered voter turnout rate, but maybe the registration rate wasn't actually that high, right? And so wherever possible, if you want to talk about capacity and voice in an election, utilize registered voter turnout if the data is available. So again, despite that high turnout that we talked about in 2020 compared to 2016, large turnout gaps. Remember I asked you earlier about voters of color? So here we've got some data for you. If we want to just follow the, where are we? The gold line. So we're looking here on the left is 2016, general presidential election. On the right is the 2020 general presidential election. That gold line right there, yellow gold line, is the eligible voter turnout for everybody, and for our data, 66.7%. And if you break it out by race ethnicity, for whites, 74.1, black, 54, Asian American, 49, and for Latino, right, if you just follow that purple along, we're looking at 47. So not that different. So when we talk about gaps, again, just to emphasize what I'm showing you here, it's just simply, again, the differences across groups, right? So everybody increased in 2020, exciting. We saw actually Asian Americans kind of, right, increase at a faster pace, a higher pace, right, kind of moving ahead, if you will, above Latinos in terms of eligible voter turnout. But we still see, even there, significant gaps for Asian Americans, right, compared to whites, right? And I compare to whites because that's the group with the highest turnout. There we go. And just really quickly on 2022, we know we saw lower turnout in 2022 in most places across the United States and as a whole, as a nation. 2018, we see the numbers, right? If we look at the total population, 48 to 46. For time, I won't get into all the numbers here, but you can just see everybody, right, going down. We see Latino going down as well. And again, disparities widen. And that's not a surprise to us in the sense that typically when we look at lower turnout elections, usually, right, disparities are significant, at least in a comparable way, or more significant. Here, this slide is just showing you the difference in turnout between those two measures I mentioned a moment ago, eligible voter turnout and registered voter turnout, right? So when we look at registered voter turnout, typically the differences across groups is less. If we were looking at utilizing current population survey data, which is a measure of turnout, and we talk about that a little bit in the report in terms of why we're not, some of the limitations of current population survey data, including geography, but very much limitations in terms of racial and ethnic groups. You would see maybe a little bit more evenness here, but period, we know that typically registered voter turnout rates are a little bit more stable and the gaps are a little bit less than eligible voter turnout rates. Again, another kind of visualization of why it's important to use eligible voter turnout. Simply there. Same thing in 2022. If for time, I just wanted to highlight that. Okay, let's move on to the representation gap. So again, I already defined it for you. What is representation? What are we talking about when we say representation?
How much of a given group shows up in the actual electorate? So how much, if there's 30% Latinos, it should be equal with 30% Latino.
Numeric representation, right? And it's just important to always just distinguish what we are talking about when we say that, right? Okay. So, speaking of Latinos, the representation gap for Latinos slightly widened in 2020 compared to the 2016 presidential election. So let me walk you through here, especially if you can't see in the back. So the red line is the Latino percent of the total eligible voter population, adult citizens, what we've been talking about, right? The gold line is the share of US voters actually casting a ballot. Sometimes we hear voters and we actually somebody means registered voters. In our case, we mean actual voters, right? And then just to throw it in for good measure, we also have the blue line, which is the Latino percent of total US registered voters. But right now, we're just gonna look at the red and the gold, right? And you see, what do you see here? At a national level, you see Latinos being 12.8% of the eligible voter population in 2020, but what? 9%, right, of those actually casting a ballot, so underrepresentation, right? In my home state of California, Latinos are about 31 or 30% of the eligible voter population. Depending on the election, anywhere from 19% of actual voters to maybe 22, 23. Obviously, things are always evolving as the population grows, but nowhere near kind of that parity, right? And here we see at a national level the same thing. And we see a slightly widening gap. And I say this just in a descriptive sense, we see a widening gap. So despite increasing the share of registered voters, which we talk a little bit about in the report, that's a positive. The representation gap still widened, right, between the red and the gold, if you will. And that's from 2018 to 2022, I should say. So, okay. Back to 2016, 2020 presidential elections, Asian Americans' share of ballots cast increased more than their share of eligible voters, right? How much that share increased. And I showed you the turnout numbers earlier. Remember, Asian Americans kind of moving past Latinos a little bit, right? Actually kind of gaining ground a little bit, if you will. And not that we're encouraging, in that sense, competition, but just notably on the chart. So here, again, the red is Asian percent of the total eligible voter population. Gold is Asian percent of the total US population. And we do see a narrowing of that representation gap, right? What we call the representation gap, but still there, right? And still noteworthy and still something, right, in terms of impactful when we talk about decisions that are made at the ballot box. Despite narrowing in presidential elections, right, this is now the midterm, we saw a widening, right, of representation gap for Asian Americans here from 2018 to 2022. So a narrowing and then a widening, right, depending on elections. So let's move on. Black representation at the ballot box. Saw a little change, just a little bit of change between 2016 and 2020. Again, comparing the red to the gold, 12 to 10, 12.5 to 10.1. I have to throw that in as a researcher, be a little more precise. Black representation gap widened between 2018 and 2022, quite significantly there between red and gold. And those are the highlights, if you will, from our research. I invite you to certainly look at the report, obviously in greater depth. We talked largely about the presidential election cycle in 2020, but in the report we do present everything by both election cycles, and we do emphasize the importance of midterms, and often how in the conversation, when we have media coverage, when we do have examinations of the state of the electorate in terms of turnout, right, the state of disparities, we usually focus on the highest performing, highest turnout election types, right, which are general presidential years. And we do not have much conversation around midterms and really anything, primaries, very little research, right? And some of that's also due to, of course, the limitations in data, but very little research at primaries, and we understand that those elections, from all the research that has been done, quite significantly, not only it's turned out lower in primaries, but the primary electorate, those casting a ballot, almost in any given primary is going to be even less representative of a midterm general or a presidential general, right? So a very select slice of the electorate that is making decisions for the general election ballot, for instance, right? Quite significant. And sometimes also, by the way, can be one factor in why some voters of color or underrepresented groups, period, don't sometimes vote in a general when they see a ballot that was selected, right? And the issues, right, the decisions that were made by a very narrow slice that might not be reflective of communities' interests. I just want to quickly talk about opportunities, because I showed you a lot of data, some positive, some concerning, right? Entrenched disparities in our electoral system. But focus back on, right, population change, right? The ever diversification of our population, the sheer size of the Asian American, Black, and Latino populations, and their overall proportional size of the US population. So the share of the total, in this case, eligible voter population is what I have here. That was Latino increased 11.4%, right? We talked about that earlier. The share that was Asian American grew from 4 to 4.5, Latino 11 to 12, Black grew from 12.4 to 12.5. And here, these groups together comprise a little over 22% of voters casting a ballot in the 2020 general election, but nearly 30% of those eligible to vote. So 22.5% is significant. And we know, of course, across states and communities, much, much larger, right? But also, there's room to grow. So for every kind of disparity story, you can flip it and talk about, right, the opportunity that is there. The work has to be done. There's lots of reasons I want to emphasize for why we see the disparities that we see, right? Quite significant. We're going to talk about those today in the panels. I'm not going to talk about those. I want you to hear about that from our panelists and have a dedicated conversation around that. These numbers are not to say, right, that that's where we should be, where we could be. And it's certainly not to say that communities of color, historically underrepresented groups, period, find themselves with lower turnout rates, right, or on the negative side, if you will, of the disparity gap because of some fault of their own, right? We have these patterns, as I've discussed, are entrenched historically, currently today, many factors, right, barriers institutionally and throughout our society, right, that impact, right, and really produce the continued underrepresentation that we see today. So we're going to have conversations around that today. But just to emphasize, right, the opportunity that is present there. And if we look just from the 2020 presidential election, 15.5 million Latino, 5 million plus Asian American, 13 million plus Black eligible voters, right? Americans of color underrepresented, making all levels of government less accountable to the needs and priorities of our diverse population. But we know that foundations, right, public agencies, nonprofit organizations, others can support, right, civically nonpartisan efforts to mobilize the over 34 million eligible voters of color who didn't cast a ballot in 2020, right? And however many more might not, right, cast in 2024, or certainly that didn't cast in the midterm election. Voters represent diverse communities with a wide range of experiences. I want to emphasize that. I'm showing you group numbers. There is a reality in predicting the likelihood of voting by your race or ethnicity, your self-reported race or ethnicity, or identified race or ethnicity. But of course, none of these groups are monoliths. Latinos are not a monolith, for instance. Wide range of experience, ideas, opinions, right, that should be represented. And there are considerable opportunities, as I've already said, to mobilize all of those voters, to get them to participate, to have their voices heard. And greater, more sustained nonpartisan efforts are certainly a part of that through governmental, philanthropic, and community efforts. And as I said lastly here, in tandem with addressing historic and current policy, right, policies that are factors quite significantly in, right, these disparities that we see. So it's not just about mobilizing, but it's also identifying and targeting, right, those other aspects of why we see lower turnout that have created barriers for communities of color. Mobilizing people of color to vote will, of course, not only influence their own political power, but make our what we started with today, right? Make our electorate, our democracy, more representative, right, and more inclusive, more robust. So the question was, will we in our ongoing research be comparing the influx of dollars and zero ending years money from the census efforts, obviously.
Yeah, and
yeah.
other
and other
same civic
yeah,
engagement.
other related, yeah. We would like to do so. We certainly are aware of it and tracking, and the difficulty is making a causal connection and trying to get a complete sense, right, an accurate sense, if you will, of what those mobilization efforts look like. So and also the complete picture, you know, of trying to get the complete picture of all of those dollars that are out there. So there's kind of reported dollars that are official from official agencies such as the census or state government, and then there's everything else. So that's the difficulty in that. But we certainly are thinking about it and aware of it. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much.